taking the time to be part of this webinar today. I hope that it will be beneficial to your organization and look forward to the knowledge sharing that will occur today. I'd like to just quickly go over the agenda of the webinar. I will also go over some housekeeping rules so that we can share information while also keeping it organized. Andrada will begin the presentation by giving an overview of Fempower, and I will end the presentation by summarizing Wave communication and introducing the new Wave blog. After the presentation, we will take questions and comments from the audience. Going into the technical aspects, as an audience member, you are automatically muted. I will keep the muting on until the end of the presentation, after which you will be able to ask questions during the question and answer part of the webinar. I am not able to see you even if your webcam is on, and you are not able to see me. If you cannot see the PowerPoint, then please simply leave the webinar by clicking the X at the top right of your screen. You can join the webinar again by clicking the link in your confirmation email. Just letting you know, the webinar is being recorded. We have a few house rules that should make the webinar enjoyable for everyone. First, have a listen to the presentation. If you have any questions during this time, please feel free to type them into the questions pane. We will then answer your questions at the end of my presentation. During the questions and answers part, I will not be able to unmute everyone at the same time, but I can unmute individual participants. So if you have a question or a comment, then please raise your electronic hand, and then I will invite you to give us your question or commentary. Lastly, I hope that you will enjoy this webinar. We've provided some pictures for you so that you can see the faces behind the disembodied voices. I'm Lina Piskernik, the Step Up campaign assistant. I will be introducing the new Wave blog to you in the second part of the presentation. Now let me hand over the mic to Andrada Filip so she can introduce herself and dive right into the presentation.
Hello everyone, I'm Andrada. I will now talk to you about the Wave Fempower Magazine. The first issue of the magazine was published in 2001 and dealt with the topic of trafficking in women. Between 3 to 1 issues have subsequently been published every year, all addressing a topic related to the overarching problem of gender-based violence. All issues of the magazine can be downloaded from the Wave website. I will now talk more into detail about the issues of the Fempower magazine published in 2015 and 2016. The aim of the Fempower magazine published in 2015 was to focus on the situation of women survivors of violence in armed conflict and war. The exposure to violence exceeds the private sphere. As a result, women experience violence in all areas of society at all times. The 2015 edition of the Fempower magazine focused on the prevention of violence against women in war and armed conflict, as well as the obligation of states and institutions to guarantee safety, protection, and access to justice to women survivors in all situations of violence. Additionally, the issue raises awareness on the systematic use of rape and sexual violence during times of conflict as a weapon and strategy of war. The 7 articles have mainly been written by women's human rights advocates and activists to emphasize the significance of women's organizations and their ubiquitous support for all survivors, whether they were subjected to violence during war, in their homes, or both. The topics dealt with are the imperative of solidarity, the substantial impact of women's initiatives and women's organizations and support services in the legal landscape, the importance of giving women survivors platforms such as the Women's Court to let their voices be heard, and gender-based violence in the Syrian crisis and throughout Europe. Moreover, the need to provide adequate support and protection before and after the testimonies of survivors of war and conflict, and the importance of data collection and human rights monitoring in armed conflict regions are also exemplified within the 2015 edition of the Fempower Magazine. The Feminist Council for Women Survivors of Male Violence, Anti-War, and Anti-Fascist activist member of Women in Black Against War, Belgrade, a feminist, anti-fascist, anti-militarist group set up to oppose the criminal Serbian regime, Lepa Mladenovic wrote the first article of the issue entitled Solidarity During Wartime, Ground to Hold On to Hope. I see, I hear, I feel you near. Feminist work with women survivors of the war from the territory of the former Yugoslavia. Mladenovic addresses the importance of and efforts of women's solidarity by having decided on collaborative support during wartime and afterwards for women coming from war zones in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and Serbia. It is for solidarity shown by individual women, activists from and near the war zones, as well as supporters from welfare regions and on conflict zones, and support provided by women's organizations that assist centers that women survivors of war have found access to aid and financial and emotional assistance. Solidarity exemplifies itself not solely through support for women survivors of war that were subjected to different forms of violence, especially sexual violence, but also through cooperation of other support services and centers. In conclusion, Mladenovic is shedding light on the insufficient support provided by governments and the additional importance of realizing the feminist responsibility to show solidarity to women and people in times of war by advocating for their rights, fighting racism, and providing assistance and information. Iris Golden, a former project coordinator at the WAVE office, highlights the systematic use of sexual violence in armed conflicts in her article, The Answers of International Criminal Law and Humanitarian Law to Gender-Based Violence Against Women in the Context of Armed Conflict and Post-Armed Conflict Situations. Gender-based violence during wartime does not stop with the end of armed conflict, as violence against women has already been occurring during times of peace. International human rights law, international criminal law, and humanitarian law has considered the immense difference of women's experiences of war. Additionally, it is of utmost importance to include women in peace building and to select a fair representation of female and male judges for a gender-sensitive approach. Golden offers some responses and good practices provided by international law to violence against women in the context of armed conflict. International human rights standards and laws, as well as its instruments such as the CEDAW Convention, continue to apply in times of armed conflict as a complementary legal source to international humanitarian law. Furthermore, the Istanbul Convention, in Article 2, Paragraph 3, particularly states that the Convention shall be applicable in times of peace and in situations of armed conflict. Golden highlights the double-sided human rights violation that women survivors of war are exposed to by experiencing all forms of violence because of a particular armed conflict, as well as being neglected by institutions and governments due to the disregard of their rights, which are nonetheless provided by the international legal landscape. To be noted, Golden also refers to the gender-sensitive International Criminal Law document, the Statute of the International Criminal Court of 1998, and its inclusion of a gender perspective, which resulted in the successful classification of crimes of gender-based violence as war crimes. The Women's Court, a feminist approach to justice, by Milos Urošević, feminist and activist of Women in Black, deals with the responsibility and accountability of the institutional legal system to ensure justice for women survivors of violence in times of war, which is best exemplified through tribunals and women's courts. Urošević refers to the first women's court from the territory of Europe that was held in Sarajevo in 2015. organized by 10 women's groups from the former Yugoslavia. Its intention was not to impose criminal sanctions, but aimed at drawing attention to new forms of criminality, which, for example, included war profiteers and international institutions whose efforts could not prevent the wars, as well as finding a peace settlement and providing safe spaces for women to talk about their experiences in public. Urošević refers to the organization of the Women's Court, its process, the elaboration, coordination, and implementation of activities involving all its witnesses, associates, the international panel of regional legal experts, and more, as well as its participants coming from all over the world. The court was meant to serve as a space where women's experiences of the injustices in times of war and peace, both in private as well as public spheres, could be heard without fear of re traumatization, vulnerability, and danger. The Women's Court dealt with violence committed during and after the 1990s, concluding that injustice and violence continued up to the post war period. I have also elaborated on the topic of sexual and gender-based violence experienced by Syrian refugees in an article entitled Refugee Women Fleeing from Persecution by Daesh. Daesh, an extremist group that has occupied territories in Syria and Iraq, has brutally targeted women and girls through sexual violence. Due to insufficient access to basic resources and specialized support services, Syrian refugee women are highly subjected to gender-based violence and sexual violence and do not receive adequate protection under existing laws. Due to the influx of Syrian refugees in present Europe, the governments and authorities of different EU member states are confronted with the need to provide appropriate asylum regulations and procedures. Additionally, regarding gender-based persecution in situations of armed conflict, as well as in the aftermath of a crisis during the peace and reconciliation process specified in Articles 60 and 61 of the Istanbul Convention, the process must be conducted in an adequate gender-specific manner. Moreover, appropriate gender-sensitive facilities staffed with personnel that adequately respond to their gender-specific needs is urged to be established. In conclusion, relevant state actors and policymakers must be aware of the series of risk factors stemming from the conflict itself, but also from social customs highly prevalent in the Middle East that Syrian women are exposed to. Director and Program Assistant of Medica Zenica, Sabiha Husic and Irma Siljak highlight the influence of their specialized women's NGO in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the article entitled The Work of Medica Zenica with Survivors of War, Rape and Sexual Violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The article gives an overview of the long history of the organization, providing comprehensive help, adequate psychological, legal, medical, and material support and assistance to women and children survivors of war, focusing on the prevention and rehabilitation from war trauma, dealing with post-war violence, sexual and domestic violence, as well as supporting victims of human trafficking. As its focal point, Husic and Siljak address the issues of trauma and violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina, along with adequately preparing, supporting, and protecting survivors before and after their testimonies. Due to the work of Medica Zenica and other NGOs, an amendment to the law on social protection, protection of civilian victims of war, and protection of families with children of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina was made, recognizing survivors of rape and sexual violence in the country as a special category of civil victims of war entitled to monthly financial support and a variety of other socioeconomic rights. Hereby, NGOs and their influence and power to collaborate with government institutions to respond in a sensitive and effective manner in order to support survivors through sustainable and efficient mechanisms are recognized as models of best practices. Lali Shengelia has been working for more than a decade in the women's NGO Funsukumi. She is the head of the information department of the organization and a member of the Creative Union of Georgian Journalists. In her article, 18 Years of Work for Women, a portrait of the NGO Sukumi in western Georgia, she reports on her work for Funsukumi, which was established by internally displaced women from Abkhazia, Georgia, as a result of an armed conflict from 1993. The importance of financial psychological support for all women, for information and consultation meetings, workshops, and trainings, as well as the empowerment of women and the protection of their rights, are highlighted in her article. Additionally, Shengelia stresses the impact of donors and donor organizations in providing the survivors with adequate legal and psychological consultations, as well as the significance of cooperating with the media and the youth. Moreover, she urges the state and society for a transparent and active response to the no longer undeniable presence of gender-based violence in Georgia. The adoption of laws, such as the law on elimination of domestic violence, protection, and of support to its victims, in 2006 in Georgia, and the subsequent implementation of action strategies are essential for the state to provide appropriate support. It is also argued in the article that the state needs to cooperate with NGOs to carve out the efforts and activities of women's NGOs and support centers into state institutions and society. The last article of the 2015 Fempower Magazine, entitled "The Impact of Armed Conflicts on the Situation of Violence Against Women in the Ukraine," by political science specialist and member of the Women's Information Consultative Center, Marina Rudenko, gives an overview of the situation regarding gender-based violence in the Ukraine caused by the war, which erupted in April 2014. Gender-based violence is exemplified through rape, enforced prostitution, human trafficking, kidnapping, acts of humiliation and torture perpetrated by mostly illegally armed forces against Ukrainian women survivors of violence. However, it is because neither sex disaggregated data is made available to the public, nor the government or civil society have access to the occupied territory that the assessment of violence against women in the temporary occupied territory is insufficient. Since the beginning of the conflict, human rights protection organizations, including women's organizations, started to collect data with the aim of informing Ukrainian law enforcement authorities and international organizations on human rights violations, as well as providing legal and social support to victims. Interviews conducted by the Women's Information Consultative Center with some women victims of gender-based violence and the publication of the report, Surviving Hell, Testimonies of Victims on Places of Illegal Detention in Donbas by the Ukrainian Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights and member organizations of the coalition Justice for Peace in Donbas, were examples given for data collection and human rights monitoring in the Ukraine. According to reports from the International Women's Rights Center, La Strada, Ukraine, domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, and gender discrimination are equally prevalent issues in the peaceful territories of the Ukraine, showcasing yet again that gender-based violence is steadily prominent, and women are exposed to and experience violence in all areas of society at all times. The Fempower magazine, published in 2016, sheds light on the significance and work of existing support services and women's organizations in Europe, and the issues of insufficient availability and funding. It is made clear in this edition that the number of shelter places and specialist support services, particularly for victims of sexual violence, is unsatisfactory. It is stressed that the Istanbul Convention, as well as the EU Victims Directive, require that states allocate adequate resources to establish appropriate services. However, there is a widespread lack of funding, as well as unsustainable funding schemes in Europe. Limited funding has a devastating impact on service provision, its quality, availability, and specialization. As a result, the rights of survivors to protection and support are curtailing. The 11 articles have been written by women's human rights advocates and activists, psychologists, as well as members of European women's organizations, support services, and centers located in Poland, Greece, Austria, Estonia, Macedonia, England, Slovenia, Ukraine, Croatia, Italy, and Portugal. The issue highlights the current situation of these 11 EU as well as non-EU member countries and their legal landscape of guaranteeing access to shelters for women survivors of violence to live in separation from the perpetrator, as well as the ability and the speediness of granting safety. Moreover, the emphasis is on the importance of recruiting adequately trained staff, as well as providing gender-specific training to the police. Furthermore, the issue refers to the launch of the Wave Step Up campaign in May 2016 with the support of UN Women, which is aimed at raising awareness on the widespread nature of violence against women and the importance of providing specialist support to women and children affected by violence. The Step Up campaign's activities to combat gender-based violence are reflected in the topics of the articles provided. My house is my castle. The protection of victims of domestic violence under Polish law, the first article of the 2016 Fempower magazine, was written by Anna Golgowska and Anna Salkiewicz. After the adoption of the Istanbul Convention, Poland's need to improve the means of separation of victims from perpetrators became a focal point, as many women stay with their abusive partners because they have nowhere else to go to. Additionally, there is a lack of specialized shelters in Poland, as women survivors of domestic violence who leave their homes are often sent to institutions for homeless women, which are not adapted to the special needs of women suffering from domestic violence. The possibility of a speedy civil trial against the perpetrator was introduced into the Domestic Violence Prevention Act in 2010. Furthermore, preventive measures to guarantee safety can be issued, which are restraining orders against the perpetrator, or in the most serious situations, even temporary arrests. In 2010, the provision of mandatory arrests was introduced into the law on criminal procedure to strengthen police responses to domestic violence and lower the rate of repeat domestic violence offenses. Protection and support of women survivors of violence in Greece. The unmet needs by Kiki Petroulaki and Antonia Tsirigotti from the European Anti-Violence Network refers to developments in Greece since 2011 regarding the provision of support to women survivors of violence. All shelters provide free accommodation, ensure coverage of basic needs, and collaborate with local social services, NGOs, hospitals, and medical facilities, including the local community, for support. Nonetheless, the support in counseling centers is limited due to insufficient practical assistance throughout and after the life in the shelters, and no provision of specialized service for survivors of sexual abuse is available. It is stressed that the current work of the police increases the risk of women survivors, as they are not trained sufficiently and often do not respond adequately. Due to the gaps in service provision in Greece, the European Anti-Violence Network is currently designing the establishment of a specialist support service for women survivors of violence to obtain reliable and accurate information about their rights and assistance before, during, and after civil or criminal proceedings, including psychological support and advice for legal, financial, and practical issues. The following article, The Situation of Specialist Women's Support Services in Austria, Findings and Recommendations from the First Austrian Shadow Report to Grevio, is a summary of the Shadow Report published in Austria in 2016. The report can be accessed online. Its recommendations are of great importance in tackling gender-based violence and domestic violence in Austria. Furthermore, its guidelines in providing sufficient and easily accessible women's support services and women's centers can be applicable to many other countries as well. The most prominent obstacle in effectively combating and preventing gender-based violence in Austria, as well as protecting women survivors of violence, is inadequate funding, especially for women's shelters. The summary exemplifies the most adequate funding model for women's shelters, which is core funding based on legislation. Core funding means that shelters can get a certain sum of money based on the size and services they deliver. This is independent from the number of women and children staying in the shelter, and also independent from the individual seeking help, in order to guarantee emergency assistance immediately to all women seeking help. Eha Reitelman, the chairwoman of the Estonian Women's Shelters Union, explains the system of women's shelters in Estonia, where support to victims of violence was established based on civil society initiatives. All shelters operate as NGOs, with some offering services in more than one county. In order to appropriately provide aid to women survivors of violence, women who had experienced violence, the services for psychological and legal assistance were improved within the framework of different projects, such as the implementation of the Norway Support Program project, developing services for victims of domestic violence, strengthening cooperation between different institutions, and raising awareness among victims and the general public. Furthermore, the Estonian Women's Shelters Union provides free training to all staff from women's support centers, as well as their volunteers. Reitelman puts an emphasis on demanding additional resources from the Estonian government and the parliament to maintain support services for all victims of violence against women across Estonia. Specialized support services, the missing link in the protection of women victims of violence in the Republic of Macedonia, is written by Elena Timushevska, the Executive Director of the National Network to End Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. It is shown that in the Republic of Macedonia, there is an evident lack of access to and availability of specialized support services, especially to women from rural areas. Unfortunately, there is no support center for victims of rape and sexual violence and other forms of violence against women in the whole country. Furthermore, none of the national helplines provide services in all languages spoken by the country's various communities. The national network points out that capacities and resources of existing shelters are very limited. There is no barrier-free access for women with disabilities, and there is a lack of professional staff. State fundis- State funding is unsatisfactory, which is why all services run by NGOs depend on foreign donations. State institutions need to immediately respond to the many significant challenges support services are facing. Sharon Hawkins, Campaigns and Public Affairs Manager at Women's Aid Federation England, highlights in her article entitled From Crisis to Crisis, the Fight for Sustainable Refuge Funding in England, that the demand for refuge spaces continues to far exceed the places available in England. Women's Aid launched the SOS Save Refugees, Save Lives campaign back in 2014 and successfully brought the issue to the attention of the public and government. However, refugees are still facing many obstacles due to the UK government's response to reduce welfare spending by £12 billion by 2017-2018, which will potentially be very damaging for support services. Because of the cuts, refuge services could be closing down and not be able to continue with their current level of service provision. Hawkins stresses the importance of finding a long-term funding solution to continue to support refugees and to provide multiple and additional support, such as mental health and multilingual support by having a diverse group of specialist support workers. Slovenia gives a very personal insight into the experience of gender-based violence in the interview with M, a 35-year-old survivor of intimate partner violence from Slovenia, conducted by a counselor from the Association for Nonviolent Communication, Tjasa Hrovat. The journey of the survivor described in the article proves that with sufficient access to information provided in a sensitized manner in guidance from specialized support services at all stages of the legal procedures, the survivor can escape the vicious cycle of gender-based violence. I am not afraid to say it, Reflections on the Initiative, written by Maria Demianchuk, a psychotherapist, discusses the Ukrainian society and how this deals with topics such as gender-based violence. After Anastasia Melinchenko, the head of the human rights organization Studena, invited women online to share their experiences of sexual violence with the hashtag I am not afraid to say it in 2016, hundreds of women and men were reacting to this media initiative by telling their own stories of violence. However, the public's responses were drastically different, from empathic identification with victims to critical and cynical comments and victim-shaming attitudes. The stories encompass topics like sexual harassment, pedophilia, gender-based physical and moral violence, rape, and assaults. Excerpts from the stories are published in the Fempower Magazine. The aim of this initiative was to stop victim blaming and the feeling of guilt that survivors of sexual violence have internalized. Director of Autonomous Women's House Zagreb, Valentina Andrašek, elaborates in her article Autonomous Women's Shelters in Croatia, Lack of Secure Funding for Crucial Women's Support Services, on the difference between state homes and autonomous women's shelters. The Autonomous Women's House Zagreb was the first to open a shelter in Eastern Europe at a time when there were no laws sanctioning domestic violence and the issue was not made visible in the public. Unfortunately, funding costs are yet another reason why support is difficult. The Autonomous Women's House Zagreb with financial support from the WAVE network, even wrote a proposal of the law on financing shelters in counseling centers. Unfortunately, the law was not supported in the end, and stricter funding regulations were instituted. The article stresses that it is imperative to have NGOs as a corrective system for the state, and highlights that most of the rules and regulations concerning shelters, but also NGOs in general, are implemented without real consultations with NGOs. Therefore, cooperation and networking with NGOs is very much needed to ensure that rules and regulations can be tailored specifically for them. Dire, Donne in Rete contro la Violenza, elaborates on the topic of women's shelters in Italy, which is still a precarious situation. It is stressed that although Italy was among the first countries to ratify the Istanbul Convention, the Italian women's shelters are largely underrated, underfunding, and far from meeting current European standards. Yet again, insufficient funding interferes with implementing the necessary policies and services. For instance, out of the 77 shelters and centers of the DIRA network, which is the sole national association that works on the issue, only 46 have one or more shelter houses able to host women and their children. Additionally, Italy is lacking more than 5,000 beds, and as a result, many women's requests remain unanswered. Evidently, focus needs to be put on adequate and transparent funding. The Survive Us project in Portugal. New challenges in the fight against sexual violence by Petra Viegas and Rita Mira from Association of Women Against Violence deals with the prevalence of sexual violence in Portugal and the lack of specialized support services for survivors of sexual violence. Additionally, the lack of proper national policies and legislation is a serious issue in Portugal. The AMCV, which offers a specialized service, requested a survivor of sexual violence who benefited from the services provided within the framework of the project New Challenges in Combating Sexual Violence to share her experience and shed light on the importance of providing adequate specialized services. The interview can be accessed online. In conclusion, the edition of the 2016 Fempower Magazine illustrates the topic of women's access to support services in Europe and existing gaps, urging governments in the EU as well as non-EU member states to find an adequate funding scheme and, as a result, provide more readily available specialist support services to combat all forms of gender-based violence. Lastly, I would like to ask you to stay tuned for this year's issue of Fempower, which will soon be published on our website. An interesting variety of articles about violence against undocumented migrant women and the human rights of undocumented migrant and refugee asylum-seeking women in Europe will be made available to our readers. Last but not least, I would like to thank our intern Beverly for her hard work in helping us prepare this webinar. Thank you for listening. I will now hand over the webinar to my colleague Lina, who will talk to you about the WAVE newsletter and the upcoming WAVE Fempower blog.
Thank you for that informative presentation on Fempower, Andrada. Now let's move on to the introduction of the new WAVE blog. This summer, we did some brainstorming at WAVE on how to make our work more visible. Not only do we want to make WAVE more visible, but we want to show all of the amazing things that WAVE's members do as well. We want to make the fight against gender-based violence more approachable for everyone. Andrada has already discussed Fempower, which is available on our website in PDF format. The Step Up webinars are also an important tool with which we are spreading the message of the campaign as well as showcasing what the WAVE staff is up to behind the scenes. We also have the WAVE newsletter, which is released on a bi-monthly basis and is structured around 3 core sections: news concerning the WAVE network and office, news concerning the countries in which WAVE members are present, and lastly, international news, usually about recent developments regarding international organizations such as the EU and the UN. All in all, the purpose of the newsletter is to provide useful information to WAVE members, but also practitioners, academics, policymakers, experts, and other interested persons about events and projects undertaken by WAVE. We currently have approximately 900 subscribers on our mailing list. Last but not least, we of course use social media to spread ours as well as our WAVE members' messages and achievements. We have started increasing in making original social media posts, which you might have noticed on our Facebook. During the UN Women's annual campaign, 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, we will be releasing more original social media posts, which we encourage you to like and share. On this slide, you can see how we generally advertise our webinars on social media. In 2016, we started making the Step Up webinars available to anyone in the world who would like to join. This has led to an incredible amount of people signing up. We have gone from 11 participants per webinar to 32 participants at the latest webinar, and with every webinar, the amount of participants is growing. Here you can see the webinars, which have already happened this year, and the titles in bold, which are the webinars still to be held this year. You can sign up for the webinars on the WAVE website. For the next year, we would also like to invite WAVE members to join in on hosting some of our webinars, so please contact me if you have anything that you would like to share with WAVE members in the world. I would love to create a webinar with you and WAVE staff members together. All webinars are made available on WAVE's YouTube account. This means it's completely free to the public. Over the next couple of years, we would like to become a center of information about gender-based violence. We have started by making the webinars public, but are also looking for other ways to increase our sharing of information. Another way that we would like to make WAVE more visible would be through a blog. This is an idea which was developed by me and seemed to have a positive feedback. The blog is planned to premiere at the beginning of 2018, so keep a lookout on our Facebook and Twitter for a countdown. A priority for the WAVE blog will be that we show all of the great work that WAVE and its members do. This means that there will be interviews with WAVE members from across Europe, where we will showcase what amazing work they are doing. Each blog article will fit into one of 3 categories. The first category is meant to show off the WAVE members and is called Member Showcase. I plan for the showcase to be more in an interview format so that the intended audience can get a feel for the vast variety of our members. Another category for the WAVE blog will be called Voices. This would be the part where members as well as WAVE staff can provide their own contributions. This would also be the part of the blog where Fempower articles from previous editions as well as the most recent would be shared. If members would like to write something for the WAVE blog, they simply would have to email me, Lina Piskernik, and we could figure out together what exactly their contribution would be. Interns will also be encouraged to contribute at least one blog post about the topic of their choice, whether it's intersectional feminism or about their experience at WAVE. WAVE has so many hardworking interns coming in and out of the office, it would be a shame to not have at least one contribution about their points of view. This category is called Interns Corner. Besides there being blog categories, there are also tags. So each blog post will be tagged with whichever topics would be relevant. The tags are also searchable on the blog, so if you're looking for an article about gender neutrality, for example, you would simply have to put the term into the search bar. At the start of the blog, I would like to keep it to these 3 categories, and we may expand to further categories later. I could imagine that we eventually also post vlogs, video blogs. Of course, we want as much interaction with the audience of the blog as possible, so commenting will be possible. To make sure that nothing offensive is posted, the comments will be screened before they are put up on the blog. Last, if you have any questions or feedback about the blog, please feel free to email me at lina.piskernik@wavenetwork.org. And well, this actually marks the end of my presentation of the blog. I hope you will follow our updates on social media so that you can join us in kicking off this awesome new project soon. Andrada and I would like to begin our questions and discussion